And it is the acquired cases that are most likely to have seizures. We know that lead poisoning, treating leukemia, that's right, the treatments for leukemia can cause ADHD. We know that strep bacteria contributes a small amount of ADHD. Why would the strep bacteria do that? Because the strep bacteria has a protein on the outside of it, and that protein is identical to proteins that occur in the brain. And therefore, your immune system attacks your brain. So it's not the bacteria. It's the fact that the immune system can't distinguish the bacteria from nerve cells. And this damages certain parts of the brain, and one of those parts causes ADHD. It's not a very common problem, but it can happen. We know the brain regions that are giving rise to ADHD, and we know that in 2/3 of children, the reasons for these brain regions being smaller has to do with genetics, about which I will say more in a moment. But let's at least go through these brain regions. The 5 regions of the brain that are interconnected to each other and give rise to this disorder are the right frontal lobe, right over here, especially over the eyebrow, and the connections from there deep into the brain called the basal ganglia. I'll show it to you in a moment. And then there are connections from the central part of the brain back to the very primitive structure at the back of the brain known as the cerebellum. That is also smaller. And then there's a very special part of the brain that lies right between the eyes, in the midline, going back on the walls of the 2 hemispheres as they come together. And deep inside, on those walls, is the anterior cingulate. And that is where the emotional dysregulation originates. Finally, there is the corpus callosum, which allows the 2 hemispheres to talk to each other, but it's no surprise. If the front part of the brain is smaller, then the corpus callosum has to be smaller. The size of this network is directly related to severity of ADHD, and in children who inherit the disorder, these parts of the brain are about 3 to 10% smaller. That's it, just 3 to 10%. Doesn't sound like much, and it isn't, but it's enough to cause this disorder. More importantly, it's not enough to use brain imaging for diagnosis. These differences are so small and so subtle that you could not use them to classify people, which is why no brain imaging technique, including Dr. Amen's SPECT scanning, is of any value for diagnosis.